Metropolitan Council. I'm Chair Robert Lilligren. We're joined by a quorum of the committee. Welcome, everyone. Oh, and just as we get going, we've been having some quorum questions lately, and so folks can just remember to respond to Michelle's very helpful emails about attendance, so we know in advance. Thanks. First on the agenda is the approval of the agenda, and if there's no changes or corrections, I'll just stand approved. Cool, that's approved. Next is the approval of the minutes of the October 3rd, 2022 Community Development Committee meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Move the minutes.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any additions, corrections, discussion? Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Next is our consent business item, the City of Brooklyn Park 610 Junction West Comprehensive Plan Amendment. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss. Discussion on the motion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. And now on to the non-consent business. Our first is item 2022-261. It's a joint committee item. It's the City of Mendota 2040 Comprehensive Plan Update, and Mr. Bolin is here to present. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren. Council members. Sorry, let's get this adjusted here. All right. Before us today is the City of Mendota's 2040 Comprehensive Plan. There's just a few of these left, but this is one that's in the northern part of the district, so kind of excited to have this one kind of come before us today. The map before you here is the regional system showing regional trails. The Big Rivers Regional Trail is one that's not far from my house that I use fairly frequently, and also showing regional parks and also the regional transportation system. This map shows the community designation of the community, which is suburban. It's surrounded by northern side is Mississippi River, and then otherwise completely surrounded by Mendota Heights with a little bit of tangent on the far northeast side to the city of Lilydale, far northern Dakota County. The forecast before you showing a modest growth, which is it's a fully built out community. There's a few empty lots that could be redeveloped, but for the most part, this is an established community, one of the oldest communities in the Twin Cities, showing just 60 in household and only 40 actual households growth between 2020 expected to 2040. The density, there's only one area of the city that they expect to redevelop, and the overall density is expected between 10 and 20 units per acre for this community that meets the standards for this, for a modest number of units that's consistent with the growth expected for the city. The existing land use, again, the dominant area is this green of part of the Mississippi River Regional Park, and then also the pale yellow is single-family residential. That sort of green stripe halfway through, that's actually Highway 13. I'm not sure why that shows up like that, but it does. That is a road, and the pinkish area is where they expect some redevelopment to occur. Sylvia Memorial Highway is the dominant east-west, or in this case, southwest and northeast, Highway 13. Even though Highway 62 passes through the city, there's no exits there. This map shows Highway 110, which is renamed to Highway 62 a couple years ago, but this is showing that the planned land use will be mostly that mixed-use commercial area. Again, they don't have anything before them at this time, but the development, if you're familiar with this particular street, it is a mixed-use area. There's a commercial area and some older commercial strips that look like are ripe for redevelopment. So the findings in the staff report are that the City of Mendota conforms to regional system plans. Mendota is consistent with the council policies and is compatible with the plans of adjacent affected jurisdictions. And the action before you today and then for the council is to authorize the city to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into place and advise the city to, within 60 days of receiving the final DNR approval, the city to adopt the Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area Plan and submit a copy of the final adopted plan and evidence of the adoption to the DNR, the council, the National Park Service within 10 days after the adoption. And that the city needs to send the council the dates of the local water management plan that was approved by the Lower Mississippi River Watershed District and the Lower Mississippi River Water Management Organization, and the date the city adopted the final local water management plan. It's a tiny city, but there's 3 watersheds within. So implement the advisory comments, the resection forecasts, and the Environment Committee will be meeting next week, and the final council and the first full meeting in November. I'm available for any questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Mullion, for the report and for your work on this. Questions on that report? Any questions? Councilmember Wolf?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions. I just found it interesting that they don't have a city water or a municipal water supply. That's kind of unique.
Yeah, City of St. Paul Regional Water provides water to the city. So there's a number of communities that the St. Paul Regional Water provides water to, and that's
Actually, in here, it says that it relies primarily on private wells and does not own or operate a municipal water supply system. So no local water supply plan is required. But
Yep, that's correct, but their volume comes from the City of St. Paul.
okay.
Cool, thanks. Further discussion on the report? Any discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Boylan has proposed a series of actions relative to City of Mendoza's 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Is there a motion? Councilmember Lee?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you, sir. And if if you were following around on the printed agenda, it was a different order than the online one. It caught me by surprise there. So our next non-consent business item is 2022-271. It's the City of St. Francis Platinum Land Comprehensive Plan Amendment. Yep, great. And, you're not Raya Smalley. It's Mr. Wycheck. Welcome.
I'll introduce myself. You're good. I'm not Ryan.
Please. Thank you, Mr. Wycheck.
Good afternoon, Chair Lilligren and the committee. Thank you for having me. My name is Eric Wycheck. I am a planning analyst in local planning assistance and a sector rep for districts 2, 9, and 10. And Raya Ismaili did work on this comprehensive plan amendment, but it is actually in my district, but she's currently away on vacation. So I'll be taking this report. Before you today is the Platinum Land Comprehensive Plan Amendment for the City of St. Francis. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, I think I can change these. Great. I'm used to online. The amendment proposes to re-guide 23.3 acres of medium high-density residential, 15.7 acres of high-density residential, and 23.4 acres of commercial to a total of 69.57 acres of medium-density residential. The proposed development site also includes 3.1 acres of commercial that will retain its existing guiding. The amendment site is located between Highway 47, which is University Avenue, and the Rum River to the east. The purpose of this amendment is to accommodate a development project that includes 113 single-family detached homes, 82 townhomes, 105 apartment units, and 3.1 acres of commercial uses. As shown in Figure 1 in your staff report, this map shows regional systems in relation to the amendment site. There are no regional system components in the vicinity of the amendment site. And just for context, the city owns and operates a wastewater treatment facility and collection system. As shown in Figure 2 of the staff report, Thrive MSP 2040 gives the City of St. Francis a community designation of rural center and diversified rural. The area affected by the amendment is shown in red within that rural center area of the city. As shown in Figures 3 and 4 of your staff report, you can see The amendment site is currently guided as medium-high density residential, high-density residential, and commercial. This amendment is proposing to change that land use guiding of the site to medium-density residential with that 3.1 acres remaining as commercial. And you'll probably note as well that this area to the east, which is called River Preserve, is the same as open space. This was within their 2040 plan, and it's within the Mississippi River Critical Corridor area, so it's undevelopable land. And by the way, we did consult with the DNR on this in relation to MERCA, and they had no comments. Table 1 from the staff report shown here illustrates the impact of the amendment on the planned residential density in the city. The amendment results in a slight decrease in the overall minimum density of the city from 3.7 to 3.3 units per acre. And as a rural center community, Thrive directs St. Francis to plan for minimum overall densities of 3 to 5 units per acre. And as shown here, the city remains consistent with this land use policy. So the staff findings are that the proposed amendment conforms to regional system plans, is consistent with Thrive MSP 2040 water resources management policies and council forecasts. However, the amendment is inconsistent with the housing policy plan. It's also compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. The proposed action is to authorize the City of St. Francis to place its comprehensive plan amendment into effect, find that the amendment does not change the city's forecast, and find that the amendment renders the city's comprehensive plan inconsistent with the council's housing policy, and therefore the city will be unable to participate in Livable Communities Act programs. Moreover, we are recommending to advise the city to become consistent with housing policy. The city may choose to guide more land expected to develop before 2030 at 12 units per acre to address its share of the region's 2021 to 2030 need for affordable housing for 50% of area median income and below. And then finally, to implement the advisory comments in the review record for transportation forecasts and water supply. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wycheck. Questions on that report? Any questions? Seeing none. Oh, yeah, please, Councilmember Chambliss.
I just want to make sure I understand where it says that the plan no longer provides any land to address its share of the need for affordable housing at 50% of AMI. Is that because there is no more suitable land to meet that, or that it's just inconsistent with our housing plan?
Mr. Wycheck.
Yeah, I'll try to address that. Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss. I might also pass this over to Community Development Director Lisa Barajas as well. But essentially, the city is reducing the guiding of land at sufficient densities that would support affordable housing. So that affordable housing need number, they're not meeting that need number by reducing the density of this area in the city. But we're often very quick to reach out to cities to hopefully get them to guide land at sufficient densities to meet that affordable housing need number. And I don't know, Lisa, if you'd like to expand on that.
Director Barajas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric covered it quite well. Councilmember Chambliss. One thing I would just note here is St. Francis was one of the communities that chose the second option that we have available in the housing policy plan to meet their affordable housing need. Most communities chose option 1, which was guide sufficient land at 8 units per acre. In option 2, it was broken up by affordability bands. So you would guide land at higher densities of at least 12 units an acre to support lower density development, lower income level development, higher density, lower density, and then at a higher income level, you would have lower densities available within these options. So they're still meeting, if you look at the chart that's at the end of your report, figure 5 shows that they are still meeting sufficient land to support their affordable housing need for incomes between 51 and 80% AMI. It's just at that 50% and lower that they need to, this is the land that they've re-guided. They did not have other land available to support that particular option. Of course, there are other options. They could choose to relook at it another way, guide additional land, or go an option one route. There's lots of choices for them, and certainly something I know staff have been communicating with them about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has St. Francis, City of St. Francis participated in livable communities by actually getting any of our grants in the past?
Director Bras?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I think we made note of that in the staff report.
Oh, sorry if I missed
No,
that.
I apologize mostly because I don't recall off the top of my head, so I went to refer to it. They are a current participant, and it looks like the last time they received an award was in the early 2000s.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
That was quite a while ago. Okay, thank you.
Question. Further questions on the report? Questions? Seeing none, Mr. Wycheck has proposed a series of actions relative to approving the City of St. Francis Platinum Land Comprehensive Plan Amendment. Is there a motion to approve?
Move approval.
Thank you, Councilmember. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkins. And with that, we've dispensed our business items for tonight, and we'll move on to our information items. And the first is Community Development Grants, an overview and annual impact. And Heather Giesel is here or not here to present.
Apologize, Mr. Chair. Heather is out of the office today with strep throat. We will
Oh,
have to, I just read my email before I came.
Okay.
We were going to have to move that one
All right.
to another time.
So we will not,
We will not hear that one today.
we
but
won't
you
hear it
can
today, but we'll hear it in the
preview the
future.
report
All
on
right. This is something to look forward to. There, we'll move on to the second of our information items on the printed agenda, which is the residential development and deeply affordable housing. And we have Joel Nios and Hillary Lovelace here to present. Welcome.
Thanks, Chair Lilligren, council members. My name is Joel Nias, in the regional, the research unit here at the Metropolitan Council. We're going to be presenting today with Hillary Lovelace from the Livable Communities Act team. We're going to look at residential development trends. I'm going to be presenting on residential development trends in the region. Oops.
Sorry.
First, we'll present our findings from our annual residential building permit survey for 2021. Looking at our annual data set of newly produced residential housing and the trends over time for this data set. Next, we'll present our findings from our annual affordable housing production data set. And then Hillary, our senior planner in Livable Communities, will present on some relevant housing policy topics, first covering deeply affordable housing production, follow-up from the presentation last year, and then presenting some potential housing policy topics to cover next year. Before we start, I'd quickly like to thank those in the research team, Kristen Ribaturas and Matt Schroeder, Lane McNamara, as well as Jim Dudley and Elias Anthan in the Information Services Department for their help on the project. And specifically like to thank all of the local communities and county staff for their participation in getting us our data, and annual data. We've traditionally received very high response rates for this annual survey permit survey. It was 96% this year. We had 100% last year. So it's a great example of collaboration between the Metropolitan Council and our local community staff. We've collected this information from local governments annually since 1970. We gather housing permitting activity information from our previous year from communities. The attributes that we gather from this data set are housing type, number of units, permit type, such as new construction or demolition, the location of the units, if it's age restricted, and also the permit value. We collect this information because it's an important data set to our annual housing population and household estimates, as well as other data models here at the Metropolitan Council. This data set also feeds into our annual affordable housing production data set, in which we record affordability thresholds for all of the units added. And both of these data sets are widely used inside and outside the council. So the numbers we're going to be looking at are net gains of housing units. These are permitted components that affect the housing stock by adding or subtracting units. There are demolitions that subtract housing units. There are conversions of warehouse or commercial units that change into multifamily residential units that are gains. There are remodeling projects that add or subtract units. So to get to the overall supply, we really want to focus on the housing change, taking into account of all the additions and subtractions. So 2021 was an incredibly high permitted year. The region added around 22,300 housing units in 2021, and this was the highest number of housing units produced since 1987. But in looking at the numbers from the previous decades, we see that the average annual housing production by decade has decreased from the previous decades, from a high of 17,800 in the 1980s to 12,200 in the previous decade, 2011 to 2020. Our residential development patterns are becoming more geographically balanced since the previous decade. In the previous decades, most of the residential development were in the suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge communities. In the urban and urban center areas and in the rural areas, we saw a smaller percentage of overall residential development in the previous decade. That trend has changed in this 2021 data, where we see a more uniform production, but with urban center communities, housing unit counts and percentages from the previous decade are higher. So there are a wide variety of housing types that are being permitted. According to our annual building permit survey, multifamily units make up the bulk of the amount of housing units added, and they have stayed over 50% of the permitted housing units produced since 2011. There were around 13,700 multifamily units permitted in 2021, which was again the highest number since 1987. The region added around 6,800 detached units in 2021, which was the largest number recorded since 2005. Overall, the share of detached development has stayed relatively static over the past 20 years at around 30 to 40%. We added around 1,800 townhomes to the region in 2021, which was the highest production number since 2007. The number of townhomes permitted remained low, but fairly consistent in the number since 2010. Townhouse development dropped during the recession, and they haven't retained the numbers prior to this. We have seen an increase recently, though, in the share of number of townhouses built as of 2019. Now shifting gears from overall housing production in 2021, we take a look at how many of the units produced in 2021 were considered affordable. On this graph, we can see that the region produced around 2,100 affordable units at 60% of the area median income or lower, which would be housing affordable to a family of four earning $62,940 annually. So overall, 90% of the housing units added in the region in 2021 were market rate, and around 10% were affordable. So there have been notable gains in affordable housing units produced since 2011. Oops. Yep. Here's the chart from the previous slide showing the number of affordable units produced since 2011. Okay. Here's the chart. Okay, so this is showing 60% AMI, the top one there. So these would be units affordable at 30% AMI, 50% AMI, and 60% AMI. So we see that slide down from 2020 to 2021. I'm on a different one here. Sorry about that. Okay, so now the lower one there, the 30% AMI. No units produced at the lowest affordability level, the 30% AMI level. We see that very few were produced with just 139 units permitted, downtick from the 320 units produced in 2020. But if we add the 50% AMI units, we see a great increase from the previous year of 2020. We added around 1,000 units of affordable housing in 2021, which was over 500 units higher than 2000. Overall, though, through the years 2011 to 2020, we have gained around 16,400 units of affordable housing. So looking back at the previous decade of 2011 to 2020, we see that we did not meet the affordable housing need benchmark of 44,600 units at or below the 60% AMI criteria. We only added around 16,400 units during the decade, although affordable housing production did take off around the mid-decade. So basically, the region fell short of their affordable housing need numbers from 2011 to 2020. But it is interesting to note that from 2011 to 2020, the urban and urban centers produced around half of their affordable housing need numbers, while the other areas came in much lower. So in looking at the current decade of 2021 to 2020, of which we have only 1 year of data, 2021, we see that the region averages the same production rate of around 1,000 affordable units produced each year at 60% AMI and at 80% AMI. The region will meet the allocation of affordable housing need numbers. The big gap we currently are seeing is the number of affordable units needed at the 30% AMI level, which has a gap of about 1,700 units a year. Regionally, we see that most of the deeply affordable need numbers, and Hillary will be talking about this next, are particularly needed in this suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge communities. And with that, I'll hand it off to Hillary.
Any questions on these first set of slides before we start moving on?
Any questions, committee members?
On page,
Councilmember Chambliss.
page 7 is where you're showing the actual dollar amount of income at each of the AMI levels, right?
On slide 7, is that?
Yeah, slide 7.
Apologies, I couldn't quite hear that.
On slide 7, at the bottom left, shows what the actual dollar amounts are of income for each of the AMI levels. Do you have like a corresponding amount of, okay, so that was for a $104,900 home price? What's the home price, the average home price?
That's the area, Councilmember. That's the average median income.
Oh, okay. Do you know what the affordable home price is at
Sure.
30% AMI?
Councilmember. So for owner-occupied unit, affordable at 30% AMI, would be $113,900. At 50% AMI, it would be $201,500. 60% AMI would be $245,300. 80% AMI would be at $316,000. And 115% AMI would be $485,900, and then market rate would be over that. Then I can give you the rental ones too. It's a little bit longer if you want those.
Okay. If that's not in the presentation, is it possible to get that?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, we can email this out to the members afterward as well, if
Okay,
that would be
thanks.
easier.
And Chair, Councilmember Chambliss, this is on the affordability limits page of our website underneath livable communities.
Thank you. Further questions, Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things. This is all new construction, so this includes renting and buying, correct?
Councilmember, yes, that's great.
Okay. And do you have, maybe it's in the presentation later, do you have the breakdown of that?
The various AMI levels?
No, just apartments versus ownership
Yes,
opportunities.
Councilmember, we do have that data available. It was not in the presentation.
Okay.
But we can also send that out to you.
I think that'd be interesting. My hunch is it's mostly apartments.
Yeah, and we do break it down by owner-occupied, rental-occupied, and co-ops.
Okay, great. And then I'm also interested in 80% AMI is showing up kind of on slide 9, but not ahead of that. And I know the goal is to really get to that deeply affordable. But we do count 51 to 80% also in affordable, correct? Okay. And we didn't notice it on the slides in advance of that, just because we're focusing on deeply affordable? I mean, the reason I'm saying that is, in the community I used to represent in Plymouth, if we could even get something at 80% AMI, we felt pretty lucky. And that's why in those suburban edge communities with the value of land, or if you're redeveloping, unless you get some major grants coming in and, you know, underwriters like that, it's just nearly impossible to do. So I know there's been a trend to kind of move money away from the 80% AMI projects and try to get it to the more deeply affordable. And I'm just wondering if that's having an impact on what the suburban communities are able to do currently, and why it's not showing up kind of in some of those earlier slides.
Councilmember, there might be 2 questions there. Hillary, you could probably speak about the 80% AMI affordability. But as far as the data associated with 80% AMI, a lot of that wasn't put in this presentation, but yeah, again, we can break that out for you at the 80% AMI level. We can even do it by tenure rental or owner-occupied or co-op.
Mr. Chair, I think it's just interesting and important because we do bring it up later, and I just know that from all my years in affordable housing, we would be at 80%, we'd go to 50, 30 if we could, but 80% was still considered workforce housing. So I don't want to lose track of that, if that's at all possible.
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Johnson. One of the reasons we only show it on the last slide is that in previous decades, the council did not consider affordable housing anything above 60% AMI. I understand that part of the reason for that, and Director Barajas will correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Livable Communities Act defines affordable housing as below 60% AMI. In this current decade, we're tracking up to 80% AMI.
Okay.
Towards our regional affordable housing need.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I appreciate that, because I'm not trying to split hairs here, but you know, when you're trying to just see what's happening out there, it's just even nice to know in that next layer of workforce housing what's happening. And then the only other thing, which isn't for tonight, but you know, we're putting this into the marketplace, and then how long does it stay affordable, right? It's the bathtub is filling, but we haven't plugged the drain scenario. So I'm always just down the road when we get that information, think about how much money is going into these projects to make them affordable. Keeping them affordable, of course, we know is critical. So I just make a note of that as well.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment on the need allocation for the below 30% of area median income. When the committee that was working on the numbers for the need was coming up with their methodology, they took out transit availability as one of the variables, and that increased the amount of units that were needed in the suburban edge and emerging suburban edge communities. Those numbers may be a little bit unrealistic because of not having transit in many of those areas. And at one time, we thought, well, transit will just keep growing and growing. Now we're finding, no, transit's probably never going to go outside of the boundaries of where it is right now. So those places may never have transit. And I've talked with social workers, you know, like when they put a deeply affordable unit in Belle Plaine, it's hard to find somebody who wants to take that unit unless they have family in Belle Plaine, because if you don't have a car, you can't get anywhere. So, you know, it's one of those theory versus reality sort of moments in the variables that maybe that wasn't the right way to go with the need allocation.
Thank you. Thanks. Further discussion? Anyone? Ms. Lovelace.
Thank you. Last year during this presentation, where staff, including Tara Beard and Kristen Raberturas, shared updates on residential and affordable housing production, we identified something similar to the last slide, where the greatest gap between need and production was in the 30% AMI band. our housing system is producing the least households in the area of most need for affordability assistance. You asked us to look further into the barriers to creating 30% AMI and find more ways that the council can support the development of these units. First, I'd like to ground ourselves a little bit in the people side of this equation before we get too into the weeds on development and further research ideas. A growing portion of extremely low-income households making 30% of area median income and below need housing but don't have any other complicating factors in their life, like a major disability or being formerly homeless or coming from traumatic circumstances. We spoke to property managers who confirmed our suspicion that more and more people who work full-time need 30% AMI units. Campaigns to bring minimum wages up with inflation have failed at the federal level, and although there have been some success at the local level within our region, we're not perfect. We know what happens when those already living with housing instability suffer one or more disruptions. To put 30% AMI into hourly wages, it's roughly $17 an hour if somebody works 40 hours a week, every week of the year, with no unpaid time off. The average hourly wage for cooks, couriers, stalkers, and healthcare support occupations are below the income limit for a household size of 3, meaning that if a couple had a young child and someone stayed home to provide childcare while the other parent worked in food service, they would qualify for housing affordable at 30% AMI. And that doesn't reflect the reality of many single-parent households with multiple children in our region. For someone living alone, which is becoming increasingly common and preferred living arrangements within our region, a person earning 30% AMI would need to make $11.85 an hour and 40 hours a week with no paid time off in the year. Minimum wage for full-time for the whole year would place a single person below 30% AMI. One of the property managers of affordable housing that we spoke to in this work told us that the household incomes of the residents that they serve have dropped throughout the pandemic, and household sizes on average have risen. We know that when cash is tight and there isn't enough room for emergencies or bad luck, like a broken arm or a car breaking down. Study after study shows that residents in our country frequently pay rent before anything else that they need, often relying on other sources for necessities of life or doing without. I'm going to move to the next slide now and bring us into a conversation more about the details of what we'll cover in the rest of this presentation. So, what makes producing a deeply affordable unit possible? What are issues we can't control but we can adapt to? What are our opportunities to support production of deeply affordable units are things that I want to cover, and the questions that I want council members to be thinking about, and I would really value your feedback on this, is which council strategies that I outline would you most like to prioritize, and do ideas for future work that I describe meet your vision? So what makes a deeply affordable unit? Now we're going to get into some numbers in dollars and cents. Building 30% AMI is difficult to build for even experienced and mission-driven developers.
Ms. Lopez, did you mean to advance your slide here?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Two different systems. On review of projects that Minnesota Housing has funded in the last few years, there were very few instances of projects that had 30% AMI units without vouchers or another source of funding covering part of the cost of rent, either for the unit or for the household. Many people who earn less than 30% AMI use a housing voucher to live in a unit with rent levels that are designated as affordable at 50 or 60% AMI. Effectively, many developers told us that a mix of AMI units within the same project is necessary in order to build some 30% AMI units. Earlier in this summer, the St. Paul Public Housing Authority noted near the end of their board report materials that the average monthly housing assistance payment the PHA made for housing voucher choice holders was over $800. And bringing that out to the year and including administrative costs, that's about $10,000 a year for each 30% AMI unit that the PHA is supporting. We know that in the markets that the Metro HRA serves and other places in our region, the cost can run much higher. Project-based vouchers are a great tool for supporting development of homes of people who earn less than 30% AMI. But all vouchers are in very limited supply. Our HRA director, Terry, behind me has presented to council members before about the balance between housing choice and project-based vouchers within our own HRA. The trade-off is challenging because the need for voucher assistance in general is so much higher than the availability. One of the things that we found in talking to developers and looking at Minnesota housing awards recently is that it was very rare that any project built 30% AMI units without the use of housing infrastructure bonds, 9% tax credits, and that even in situations where developers had zero debt and used a lot of grants to control the costs of the building, they still needed rental assistance to help maintain the building with rents at 30% AMI. So there are a couple of things in the affordable housing landscape that we, as the council, don't quite have the power to change, but we can adapt to these things. 30% AMI unit rents do not cover capital or operations costs, and there needs to be continual support in order to make those living arrangements possible. In the second bullet point, housing tax credit rules for income averaging. As you may remember, a couple of years ago, developers began building units with income averaging guidelines allowed by HUD that allowed them to kind of adaptively change the mix of units and AMIs within the building to adapt as people's incomes changed, and allowing for some very deeply affordable units to be possible. Changes at the Treasury about 2 years ago made the implementation of that nearly impossible, and in the last 2 weeks, the Biden administration offered some changes to that at the Treasury, and we're watching closely to see how that plays out. But it seems like income averaging could be back as a tool to build more deeply affordable units. Okay. We can't be entirely in charge of external market forces like supply chain issues and interest rates, but that's something that we, as the council, can adapt to. In the next presentation, Joel Hudding is going to speak a lot more about the impacts of inflation on current rents. So I'm just going to list out that inflation is not only impacting the earned wages of a lot of people in our region, but it has also changed the rent limits that HUD has set. They used a new factor for inflation in this past year for 2020 values of area median incomes. Construction costs have been very variable due to inflation, not to mention energy costs and mortgage rates. The good news in the affordable housing landscape that we can't really control is how other agencies choose to fund their priorities. Minnesota Housing prioritizes projects that include deeply affordable units, and over the last few years, we've seen this starting to work. Developers know that the criteria effectively requires that all tax credit and HIB-supported developments include at least a few units affordable at 30% AMI and below, which has made the competition for sources that cover the gap, like housing choice and project-based vouchers, all the more important. So, what can the council do? Things that we can continue to do are at the top of this slide. For grants, we can continue to prioritize deeply affordable units as we have, and incorporate housing choice voucher payment standards into scoring to ensure that voucher holders can access these units. There are times in which we fund affordable projects that include 60% AMI units, which cannot always accept vouchers, even though the project may accept vouchers as a whole. The payment standards don't always line up, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that as we score projects when they come in. We want to continue to track the rate of deeply affordable units and income averaging projects as we go forward, and increase focus on preservation and stabilization, where keeping people stable is perhaps most important and the greatest stretch of our dollar for 30% AMI units, and promoting inclusionary development at the local level. A couple of communities across the region adopted inclusionary development policies over the last 10 years. I don't want to toot our own horn too much, but the council did do a lot of supportive work to encourage the development of inclusionary housing policies. The city of Bloomington took it very seriously and adopted their own opportunity ordinance in 2019, and they have already, at this point in the decade, a year and a half in, met their need for affordable units at 60% AMI by using local financing tools and making a clear case of the nexus between affordable housing and the use of their financial programs to support affordable housing development. They're choosing to only use tools now to meet the need for lower AMIs within their community because they've met the need so quickly. Obviously, not every community has the development potential of the city of Bloomington, but I think it's compelling the way that they've chosen to meter out the use of their tools, especially their local financial tools, to support the development of deeply affordable housing and tracking the development in their region. Three things at the bottom of this slide that we're not currently doing that we'd like to look into further and that we'd welcome your feedback on are explore the role of the Regional Development Guide in highlighting the importance of living wages. I'm not totally sure where that belongs in the Regional Development Guide, but I think it's relevant at this point to our work in housing policy. Quantifying the risk of inaction, what happens to our communities and what happens to people when we don't provide housing that people can afford, and exploring defining affordable housing limits differently. As we approach the season of housing policy plan writing, we want to further explore two things that I'll tell you about in more detail in the next year before we come back with a similar presentation. One of the things that we'd really like to do is further explore deeply affordable research. One of the questions that we couldn't answer with the staff that we have is what would happen if we went full tilt towards building affordable units? What would the impact be within the affordable housing market? If we, in effect, freed up more 50 and 60% AMI units by building more 30% AMI units, what would our affordable housing market look like? We also want to quantify the risk of inaction. What is the downstream social and fiscal impact of cost burden 30% AMI households? When people don't have a place to live, where is government paying for this further down the line? I've included a picture from King County, Washington's racial equity study and report that shows the impact of not meeting needs at the top of the stream and then the outcomes for both at the individual level and at the societal level are very different. And then the second point, in the game of musical chairs, if we build more 30% AMI affordable units, what would be the impact on the availability of 50 and 60% AMI units for others in our region? The other thing we would like to explore in the next year with your enthusiastic support is area median income. There are a lot of things that are useful about area median income. We have a pretty broad understanding at this point after talking about area median income for so long about what it means. Though very few people understand the methodology of how we come up with income limits and area median income, I think most people have kind of come to accept it as a way of measuring this. It's a federal standard, and specifically the way that we calculate area median income for our programs in livable communities is we follow the formula that Minnesota Housing uses for low-income housing tax credit units, which, as I mentioned before, almost every project that is building any 30% AMI has 9% housing tax credits. However, there are a couple of things about area median income that don't serve us so well as a region. It broadly assumes a standard family size. As we were looking earlier, back on, I think it was slide 7, at the income limits for a family of 4, we're assuming, they calculate it starting from a family of 4 and then build it out to other household sizes, which doesn't really reflect the household diversity within our region. For a long time, people who've lived in affordable housing don't totally understand what area median income means, and in conversations with community members, it doesn't match the reality of their experience. And lastly, inflation in the broader regional economy has not directly corresponded to changes in low-income residents' earnings. Although, the area median income may have changed, the low-income wages have not changed appreciably, and that's who we're looking to serve when we're building affordable housing. So what we're thinking about is different measures of affordability. We can set a standard of affordability that translates to area median income, but doesn't solely rely on it. I think in policy conversations, area median income is useful because we all know what it means, but it doesn't actually help us solve the problems of people within our region. So I'm going to show you a table that compares HUD annual income limits at 30% AMI, which we use to calculate our standards of affordability for LCA programs, and compare it to living wages calculated by the MIT Living Wage Calculator for different household sizes between 1 and 5. This comparison shows two main things. One, even when we're subsidizing people's housing, we're not leaving enough left over for households to cover other costs. And two, that the cost of living has risen dramatically for households with children. The MIT Living Wage Calculator defines two different types of households with children. One where one adult provides childcare for children under school age, and one where both adults work. I chose to use the wage definition where one parent provides for childcare because those families have a lower living wage, because it is often more cost-effective for one adult to provide childcare than it is for them to work and pay for childcare. I'm not suggesting that we add more qualifications before people are able to access affordable housing, but I am suggesting that we as the council have the power to use this data to set affordability measures that respond to the trends of our region. That low-income households are becoming more common, and that if we continue to rely solely on HUD's definition of affordability in our measurement of the development of the region, we'll be missing part of the picture on how larger households and households with children fare in our region. And that concludes my slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lovelace. Questions or discussion on the report? Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't understand what you were getting at with that last slide, how things would be different. Can you explain more?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to me.
So, oh, did I not go back up here? Thank you. One of the things I think we could do is, instead of relying on AMI to define what affordability means, we could come up with our own standard. It doesn't have to be MIT's living wage, but I thought it would be helpful to see an example of what one style of affordability could look like. So instead of thinking about how low someone's wage needs to be in order to be helped, we could think of it as, what do people need in our region to succeed? For a long time, we've thought about paying 30% AMI, or 30% of your income towards housing is a fair standard for low-income families. And what we're finding is the reality of what people need in order to survive and thrive within our region is different than that. Does that help answer your question?
Councilmember Wolf.
Well, so if we're already short of housing, raising the income limits means that more people would qualify and we'd be even shorter of housing? Is that how it would work? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Not necessarily. I think shifting how we view affordability to match the residents of our region would give us a better picture of what's actually happening.
Further discussion, Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Chambliss, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. I'm going to stay on this point because the last slide is like kind of a lot to digest. But so Hillary, let me just try to restate what I think I'm hearing you say, which I think I've been talking about when I was doing some housing work here recently, a couple years back. But what we're trying to say is, what does it cost for a person to live? Not just live in a home, but live, right? And so markets and regions will vary based on what's going on. So maybe what you're saying too is we can take into account what our region and Minnesota markets are doing, because we're even different than the national inflation rate right now. We're a little bit better. So I think I hear where you're going. My question is then, because AMI is built into state law and federal, how then can we, where I like where you're going, where we could be going, because I think it's more reality-based, how do we then pivot from those numbers to put into formulas where we can still bring in funding into our programs to partner with Minnesota Housing or wherever? That's a big one. And I'll just leave it at that, because that's a big one.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Johnson. I really appreciate the question. I think that making it easy for people to understand the translation between two different standards would be really important. I think that there's use in it in that the audiences are pretty different. There's a group of people who relies on us for funding, you know, mostly cities and developers. And then there's a group of people who relies on us for understanding of trends within the region. Residents, city staff when they're speaking to electeds, in a way that's pretty different. So I think it would be important to make it transparent how we're doing that work. And I think that we can rely a lot on the transparency that we've already built through our research unit, where when y'all had questions about where the data was coming from or how to view it later, it's all already online.
Just a brief follow-up.
Councilmember Hudson.
I really dig this. I think that even if AMI stays, but to have that corresponding number sitting right there so that you can already start to translate what we're used to and what we're trying to even further comprehend. And I'm just gonna say this too. So I was at an MLC, Municipal Legislative Commission meeting in Edina, probably last session, and a lot of the discussion there, that's suburban cities that are banded together in their own association. And they were discussing affordable housing, and the cities were really trying to make the point to visiting legislators at that meeting, the, you know, efforts that are being made in cities like Bloomington or Edina or what have you, fill in the blank. And this kind of information, I think, could really help our legislature to also understand that it's not just about this number and then the market does what it'll do, or we'll put money in and we're still losing ground, right? I think what it's trying to do is bolster the whole conversation, and this is, I alluded to this, I think, during our budget meeting a couple weeks ago. We need a whole bunch of people together in a room, not just the housing people, and maybe not just some employers who are in part of the state and they're having a hard time getting employees, so they know they gotta pitch in and build housing. We need to talk about the economy. And there's a lot of smart people who can do that. And maybe now, in this disruption of economy and everything, is the time to do it. And at least if we can put together the what it takes to live numbers alongside what we're used to looking at, we can start to maybe help people to develop, I think, a broader understanding of the dire situation that we're facing out there. And to be perfectly honest, based on the numbers, taking out the human side of it, the drag on the economy that it has. So I remember, sorry, but back in the day when the Twin West Chamber was on the forefront of, well, actually, the city of Plymouth was on the forefront of banning phosphorus in water. And we were the first one to do it. And the Chamber of Commerce was not too happy about that, went to work for them after that. But we then peeled it back and we said, okay, if it's not about the environment, which they care about the environment, but it was banning it from the local stores of selling it, and there's an impact to the retailers. But then we showed them the cost of removing it from the water, and it passed. So it's just coming at this maybe from different points of view that good people can also come at a problem to solve. I know that was a bit of a soapbox moment, I'm sorry, but this is inspiring to me, and I really like how it's being framed.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Chambliss, then Councilmember Lee. Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you. I really appreciate a chance to dive into the how we look at housing affordability, how we resolve for it, and how we plan for it. It's just a different dive, a different angle for us to look at it, because, you know, we have multiple meetings talking about very similar things on this committee and in the housing work group that many of us sit on. You talked about how we can close the gap between AMI and the residents' experience. So I think if we can prioritize and highlight that in our regional development guide related to housing affordability, I think that will be important. As Councilmember Johnson said, enhancing like the grid that we have now with additional information about the cost of living. Just adding the livable wages is not enough. We need to talk about livable expenses. Because if you have a family that has children and the childcare gets to be such a big part of their pie, that can that can put strain on the family as well as a low wage. So we need to look at the whole picture in terms of housing affordability. It's not about just the wages, it's about their expenses as well. And so when we lobby for support from our legislator, we need to lobby for support for those expenses so that people can, it's much easier to, provide for childcare than it is to, build a house that's affordable. So we need to think of that as well when we're advocating. I was glad to hear about disability issues, because that is a big factor and it's probably even growing. As we know, a lot of issues are occurring with mental health and other disabilities that need to be supported. A lot of people cannot work 40 hours a week because of their disability. And they don't have paid leave. If they don't work, they don't get paid. So we need to advocate for folks that have a disability so that they can stay in their homes, whether it's a tax credit, a housing credit, or paid leave, but which is through the employers. How do we develop stronger partnerships with, I feel like a lot of times we're operating in silos, with the county and the legislature and Met Council. If we really want to propose how we can work together and partner in our regional development guide, that may help. People do really look to us as the expert. Oftentimes they think we have more authority to enforce some of the things that are in our plans and in our, that are outside of our control. Yeah, we can say what the criteria is when we give our grants out, but that partnership piece is important. I mean, sometimes I feel like you hit a wall when you're trying to work with an outside entity, and we've got to cut through those silos.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for this presentation. I like this idea because I think if we really want to, we're basically really trying to measure how poor or rich people really are, and this is an important issue. In the previous slides, you talked about how nebulous the idea of AMI is. For those of us who get paid to understand this kind of stuff, we get it, but like you said, the regular folks don't get it. And so, look at the federal poverty line, like that definition or equation hasn't changed in 30 years, but Congress raises itself a raise every couple of years. And so if we really want to be equitable, we have to think about different metrics and different ways to be transparent. This reminds me of the idea of targeted universalism by scholar John Powell, who basically says that each of us needs different resources based on who we really are, right? And this is why we fight for disaggregated data. So, for example, if Councilmember Musa and I are trying to scale that wall to see past that window, Abdi's obviously going to need a shorter ladder than I do, right? And so we don't need the exact same resources. You look at like immigration issues. You look at like, for me as a Hmong person who came here as a child of refugees and immigrants, if you look at the larger Southeast Asian diaspora, like a lot of the Vietnamese folks and Thai folks who came here in the same way as a direct consequence of the same war in Vietnam. A lot of those folks, their parents, they came from the ruling class. So their parents are going to be officers and philosophers and ministers and military and police officers. And so, but for some of us, like Lao folks and Hmong folks, our parents were the foot soldiers. And so we're going to come here our parents are going to come here without a certain education, certain transferable skills. And so we're going to start off in a different place. And so this reminds me of the ideas of being really equitable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion? So, Ms. I have a question about a slide, or an earlier slide, but just to support this idea of using broader, more inclusionary metrics in these. I think that is really helpful. And I'm sure we've all had the experience when someone says, well, how do you define affordable housing? It's like, well, how long do you have? And so, but I think this showing the real cost of, what were you calling it, Councilmember Johnson?
Mr. Chair, I just said what it takes to live.
What it takes to live, right, and then the impact. It just seems like it would be a more helpful conversation. And I think this idea of quantifying the risk of inaction is really helpful too, not just to show other sort of resource holders, but to show everyone. And this, I really like the graphic that you used from, was it Cook County? No, or King County, right. So, yeah, thanks. And the question I had was back, it was on slide 13, and there's this reference to properties that have zero debt and grants. And I understand that 30% rent isn't going to cover the costs of operating that property. I get that, but I'm just wondering, how many deeply affordable units did you find? How deep was that data set where they were actually carrying no debt or no grants? And what can we learn from those?
Yeah, Councilmember Lilligren, very limited.
Okay, I figured.
An edge case, for sure. I included it mostly to make the point that even in that scenario,
It doesn't work.
it doesn't pencil. So,
All right,
yeah.
thanks.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for all of the comments,
Yeah,
Councilmembers.
thank you. I hope it was helpful. Anything else, committee members? All right, thank you very much. Thanks. Good food for thought. And committee members, we will move on to our final information item. It's the small area fair market rents discussion, the ongoing discussion. We have Ms. Smith and Mr. Hudding here to present. Welcome.
Hello, committee
Hello.
members. Thanks for having us tonight. We're going to have some tough conversation to follow Hillary and Joel's presentation that sort of set the stage for us. But Joel and I are here to talk to you about the new small area fair market rents that have been released and how that relates to payment standards. So I'm going to start with just a few grounding slides, and then Joel's going to cover some research and data that he and his research team have uncovered that relates to this discussion, and then we'll continue with scenarios and have plenty of time for discussion. And so I'm Terry Smith. I'm the director, as you know, of the Metropolitan Council HRA, Metro HRA, and I'm joined by my super smart colleague, Joel Hudding, who's the senior manager in research. And so we're going to kind of tag team a little bit. So this is just to sort of ground us and where we're at, but you will recall that payment standards are rent limits. So this is the amount that's issued to a voucher holder when they're out shopping for a unit to use their housing choice voucher. The payment standards are limited by fair market rents. So each year, HUD releases fair market rents and small area fair market rents, and then housing authorities across the country are charged with setting payment standards between 90 and 110% of those fair market rents. And our goal is always to have those limits high enough to ensure that voucher holders have choice in where they live, but then low enough to serve as many families as possible. You will also recall that back in 2020, we adopted what's called small area fair market rents, and these are payment standards and rent limits that are set at the zip code level instead of setting one limit for the entire metropolitan area. So it gives us quite a lot of flexibility and allows for fluctuation in different zip codes throughout the region. There's a lot of words on this slide, but ultimately Thrive 2040 gives us some direction in this. And encourages us to adopt payment standards that allow residents full choice in where they live, regardless of income or ability, and then that we really want to become a region where everybody has broader housing spectrum where all people can thrive. Joel's going to take over the next couple of slides.
All right, Mr. Chair, council members. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of an overview of the rental market. And I'll start by saying, if you put one foot in boiling water and the other foot in ice water, you don't feel cold or feel comfortable on average, right? And that's kind of the thing I like to remind people about averages, right? Is that an average does not reflect the range of experiences that people have, right? It's good for kind of characterizing the overall trend for something, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about, even when we break this down to submarkets and whatnot within the region. We're still talking about averages, and so there's a range of experiences around that. But in any case, this first slide is just showing the average asking monthly rent by class and the average asking monthly rent by bedroom size. And you can see it's certainly a lot more expensive than when I was a renter back in 2007, 2008 in the region, and it has gone up a lot. Class A is going to be your luxury type apartments, so high amenity luxury apartments. Class B and C are the kind of the bread and butter of the market. It represents about 85% of apartments. Those are going to be the types of apartments that are going to be most accessible to participants in the HRA programs. And you can see pretty clearly that Class C rent, in other words, the rent that's most affordable, has increased the most over time. So we're looking at the percent change since 2010 on this plot. And the dashed red line is general inflation over time. And you'll see a couple of things on there, right? You'll see, number one, Class C rent prices have increased much faster than inflation, even when accounting for that the quite high uptick in inflation over the last couple of years. Class C rents have still increased more than inflation. And then you can see Class B rents increased faster than inflation for much of that time. You remember when we were giving these presentations, we were always talking about rent prices rising much faster than inflation. That was all during that, 2015 to 2018 kind of time period, really driven by Class A and Class B apartments. And then you can see still today, Class C or luxury apartments have grown much slower than inflation. So the luxury apartments that are available to people who have high incomes are the ones that have increased the least, and has likely a lot to do with the amount of development that has been in that segment. Studio apartments, of course, have increased slower. There was a huge amount of studio apartment development, a little bit earlier, and you can see that line just sort of flattens out after roughly 2017 or so, and studio prices have been relatively flat, just starting to come up again. So basically, if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom apartment, and it's a Class B or Class C apartment, it's you're facing something that's going to be increasing a lot in price over the last decade or so. Potentially good news is that it could be worse. Interesting new trend here, where the Twin Cities rent prices are actually increasing slower than other areas. Now, yeah, I mean, they increased 3.6% in the last year, and that's historically a pretty high increase in rent prices on average. But, it's a big national story right now that rent prices are kind of out of control, and they're one of the big factors that are driving overall inflation, right? We talk about inflation being out of control. One of those things that's contributing to that is rent prices. That's happened less so in the Twin Cities region, probably connected to all that development that my colleague Joel was just talking about earlier. And so another thing to note is that vacancy rates are up. This is part of why rent prices are not increasing quite at the rate of inflation these days. And so if you have vacant units in your apartment, it's going to make it harder for you to raise the rents, right? And so it's pretty simple how that works. But in any case, you can see when rent prices are under that healthy vacancy rate level, that green line on there, if you all remember, during those years, rent prices were increasing much faster than inflation. And you can see over the last couple of years, inflation or the vacancy rate ticked up, and it's remained high and a little bit above that healthy vacancy rate level. And so you really want it to be right around that healthy level. And when it gets a little too high, prices are controlled, but at the same time, landlords may be less likely to, do maintenance, they may defer maintenance, because they're facing higher operating costs, right? If their costs are going up at a faster rate than they can increase rents, they may choose to do things like defer maintenance. And so that can sometimes happen. I don't think it's going to happen at this rate, but in any case, we are a little bit above that healthy vacancy rate level, and that's part of why our rent prices aren't going up as fast as inflation. But keep in mind, inflation is 6 or 7% in the last year in the Twin Cities. And notable is that Class C vacancy rates are the lowest, and they have been the lowest at least back through 2010. In that green line there at the bottom, you can see Class C vacancy rates are really quite low, especially compared to Class B and Class A. And just looking at this by community, I think it's you see a lot of interesting patterns emerge. The first thing, the map on the left, you'll see the increase in rent prices from 2010 to 2022. And you can see these really hot spots all over in the HRA service area. While, Minneapolis and St. Paul, rent prices have still increased quite a bit, just not as much as in a lot of the suburban areas where the HRA serves. The middle map is just showing this as a relative change, so putting all the communities on the same level, looking at percent change, 2010 to 2022, still shows the same general pattern. You see some real hot spots in Plymouth and Crystal and Woodbury too. And then the map on the right is showing your percent change inflation adjusted. So all the green communities there, those are communities that have increased right about the rate of inflation. And so their prices have increased by around 32% over the last decade. And you can see there are several communities that have increased much faster than that even. And just looking at recent change, kind of taking a point right before the pandemic compared to today, and you see that same sort of general pattern emerge. But I think one of the things that really sticks out, if you look to the plot at the right, is that a lot of communities are seeing rent prices that are slower than inflation. And so, make what you will of that is when inflation is 6 or 7% per year. But in any case, that's at least a little piece of positive news, is that it could be much worse. And really the conclusion here is pretty simple. If you're a tenant trying to get an apartment in an HRA service area, 1 or 2 bedroom, it's going to be tough out there. And you will have seen some pretty sharp increases in prices.
So maybe we should pause, Mr. Chair, and see if there's any questions for Joel before we get into the next section.
Thanks, Shane. Questions, committee members? Any questions? Seeing none, please continue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is just sort of a reminder. You've seen this slide a few times, but HUD essentially says, here's your money for the year. Now go out and serve as many families as possible. And so this year, our subsidy budget is $76 million. As rents go up and the average cost per person goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean we get more money. So we try to work within our budget. There are some set-aside options. We did apply for some set-aside to ensure we can serve all of our families. So it's looking like we're going to get another $2.5 million on top of that. But essentially, the thing we're playing with, and I think of this sort of like a teeter-totter, if we have higher rent limits, that means voucher holders are more successful. They have open up, more unit choices. They have higher options and higher success rate of using their voucher, and maybe more locational choice. If we have lower rent limits, then we have a lower average subsidy, which theoretically means we can serve more families if they can find units within the rent limits, and then lower success because people have a tougher time finding a unit. So we're always trying to find that sweet spot, which I think this year, and I've been doing this work for a long time. And I would say the last couple of years with these rents has been the toughest yet. And so we have some really tough decisions to make. So I'm hoping to lay out some information to help us make those decisions, help you all make those decisions. So when we're looking at payment standards review each year, when fair market rents and small area fair market rents come out, we're looking at average rents. We're reviewing average rents with Joel and the research team provide us with reports, average rents by community and bedroom size, and a couple different ways of looking at that. We are interested in vacancy rates. What are vacancy rates doing? So overall, as Joel indicated, vacancy rates are up, which is good news for us, but they're not really up in the units that are open to voucher holders. We're looking at rent burden, and when we talk about rent burden, we're looking at the percentage of current voucher holders that are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And that happens when their rent becomes higher than the payment standard. So we're looking at that, and those are all the things that sort of play into our analysis when we're looking at adopting new payment standards. So in terms of tenant rent portions, and you've heard this a few times, I just think it helps ground us, but tenants are generally paying between 30 and 40% of their income towards rent. So if they find a unit that's within the payment standard, you know, at or below, they pay 30% of their income towards rent. If they find a unit above the payment standard, they pay 30% plus the difference. So part of that, you know, difference comes out of their pocket. When a tenant initially moves into a unit, they cannot pay more than 40% of their income towards rent. So each tenant, when they get their voucher, they get a maximum. Here's the maximum amount you can spend, and it's different for each household because it's income-based. And so the difference really depends on how far above the payment standard a household can go. Here's just a simplified example to sort of illustrate this, but let's say household A is going to rent a 2-bedroom in Maplewood, and the rent on that unit is $1,275. If we have a payment standard of $1,200 in that community, that means, of course, the rent is $75 more than the payment standard, so the family pays 30% of their income plus $75. The example below, let's say we increase that payment standard to $1,300. Now that rent falls within the payment standard, so the tenant's going to pay 30% of their income towards rent. Our average per family subsidy costs keep going up. And this has been a trend for the last several years. Historically, before this, you know, rents would average subsidy would go up by about 2% per year. But you can see it has skyrocketed the last couple of years, and even the growth between 2021 and 2022 is over 8%. And part of that comes from rents are continuing to go up. We've seen some of the most astronomical rent increases in the last couple of years that we've ever seen in our programs. I think the other thing is tenant incomes have gone down a little bit, so that means our portion goes up. I think the other part of the equation is that we implemented small area fair market rents, and so if we're paying more, then it costs us a little bit more. So all of these things play into that. This is sort of another way of looking at it. So again, say we have $76 million to work with. In that we have almost 7,000 vouchers. We have 6,997. So I think in 2023, actually maybe even this year, we'll get over 7,000, which would be cool. But we have 76 million to work with. And you can see in the chart on the right, if our average per family subsidy is 900, we can essentially serve all of our voucher holders. If our average per family subsidy goes up to 1,000, that means we can only release or issue 93% of our vouchers. So those average subsidy costs make a big difference in terms of when we're planning and when we're trying to figure out how many people can we serve with the money that we get from HUD. So, you know, we've always had a question. Sure, we implemented small area fair market rents in 2020, so we have about 2 years under our belt with the implementation of this. We hire Housing Link to do a variety of data things for us in a given year, and one of the things they did for us this year did some analysis on the change in the number and percentage of rental units that fall under the payment standards when you're looking at fair market rents versus small area fair market rents. And I think the conclusion of that story is that by implementing small area fair market rents, we opened up additional rental units for voucher holders. So when we're looking at rental units in the community, had we continued with fair market rents, only 30, does that say 31? 31, I don't have my glasses, I think it's 31% fall within the FMRs. But by adopting small area fair market rents, we now have about 55% of the rental units that can fall within that. So it just means that voucher holders have improved choice and improved locational choice when they're out shopping with their voucher. We had a resident advisory board. Stephanie talked to you a little bit about that with the PHA plan item a few weeks ago, but we held a meeting with our resident advisory board on Thursday, July 14th. And one of the things we wanted to dig into with them, and there's a lot of words on this slide, I don't expect you to read it all, but our goal was, how is it out there shopping with a voucher? Are you having success placing your voucher? What are the challenges that you're facing? Are the rent limits that we have, sufficient for you to find units? And all of these comments that are summarized below there are that families are really having challenges finding rental units. And for the reasons Joel has talked about and the reasons that I've talked to you about. Landlords, one of the members said that they talked to a landlord that used to participate in the voucher program, but is no longer participating because the payment standards aren't adequate enough to cover the rent. And so the same things we know anecdotally and that our staff know just from working with voucher holders and know their struggles from day after day, we're hearing from the resident advisory board, we're hearing from landlords. And so all of these things are telling us, we need to do something, and the next slides are going to show you, we need to increase payment standards, and these are some of the reasons why. So I've laid out 3 options today. It doesn't mean we have to land on one of these options, but just for scenario purposes. And the first one is that we make minimal changes. You'll recall in an earlier slide, HUD says, here are the new fair market rents, now adopt payment standards within 90 and 110% of that. And so if there are zip codes that are below that, we have to increase them. Or if there are zip codes that are above that, we have to decrease them. And so in this option, we would just be making the required changes. There are no zip codes in our entire service area. There are 124 zip codes that we work with. None of them had decreased small area fair market rents. So that says something to us real loud and clear right off the bat. Option 2 would be to adjust all of the zip codes to 95% of the small area fair market rent. And then make some additional changes based on market and average rents. So when we're looking at our average rents by community and by bedroom size, we know certain parts of the region are just not working at all with our payment standards. So we're using that information to make some additional tweaks. And then the third option would be to adjust all to 100% of the new small area fair market rents. Again, no reductions, but it would be sort of a re-benchmarking, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So under option 1, if we were to make only the required changes, there would be increases in 79% out of 124 zip codes. Again, decreases in rent limits to 0 zip codes. One of the things I talked about, we're looking at rent burden when we want to know how many of our current voucher holders are rent burdened in their current unit. And today that number is 60%. So there are 60% of all voucher holders that are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. That's a big number. I've never seen it that high. And we need to bring that down. HUD's sort of rule of thumb on this and guidance is that you don't want to have more than 40% of your voucher holders paying more than 30%. So this is much higher than we want to see it. If we implemented only these required changes, again, it's the increase in the 79 zip codes. The future rent burden would go down to 48%, but doesn't even get us down, to sort of our goal range. And so it's not within the goal range of less than 40% rent burden. When we're looking at these percentages, just a note, we're looking at where people are living today, what their income is today, and what their rent is today, and assuming nobody moves. We don't know that's not the case, but this is the best case scenario based on today where people are living. In terms of implementing this, it costs about $1.9 million to increase the payment standards to this. And again, it's based on where people are living today and what their rent is. And when I say reduction in service to 160 families right there, it doesn't mean that if we implement this option, February 1st, 169 people lose their voucher, or 160 people. It just means that 1.9 million is enough to serve that many families. So I'm trying to sort of quantify that for you. But then again, we don't know what our federal funding will be for next year, and so it could very likely be that we get enough money to serve all the current voucher families that we have on the program. Option 2 that I've laid out here for you is to adjust most of the zip codes to 95% of the small area fair market rent, and then make some of those market-driven changes. It gets kind of tricky when you start doing this because you're playing around with 124 zip codes, and you don't, do you increase this one and not this one? And do you increase this one and not this one? And because the average rent data that we get, although we do get it by zip code level 2, we're looking mostly at it by the community. And so it becomes real tough when you're just tweaking around with a couple of zip codes because you're making a lot of assumptions when we're doing that. But under this scenario, we'd be increasing payment standards in 111 zip codes, so almost all of them. Decreases in 0% of the zip codes again, or 0 zip codes. Our current rent burden again right now is 60%, so 60% of voucher holders are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And the future rent burden under this scenario gets us down to 39%, so just below sort of the benchmark and guide for that. In terms of implementing, the cost of implementing this, and this again assumes full implementation, which takes a full year, nobody moves, nobody's rent increases, nobody's income changes, would be $3.6 million, and that's enough to serve 315 voucher families. And again, we don't know what our federal budget looks like, so we could hope that we get enough money to cover service to all of our current voucher holders. And the last scenario that I have here is to adjust all the zip codes to 100% of the fair market rents, small area fair market rents. So this is the sort of re-benchmarking, resetting the playing field for all of the zip codes. This would result in increases to 117 zip codes. And the only reason that's not 124 is because there are a few communities that were already at 100% of the small area fair market rent. The current rent burden is well, that should say 60%. There's a typo on this slide. It should say 60%. I apologize for that. And future rent burden would go down to 20%. So below the threshold, and just sort of a side note on that, between years so say we get down to 20% with the adjustments of these, then it just generally increases over time because landlords give rent increases for tenants that are in units. And when they go above the payment standard, that increases rent burden. So although we bring it down, it doesn't stay there for a long time. It continues to creep up. And then we go down and then sort of creeps up. And this implementation cost, this one has a bit of a sticker shock. It's $5.1 million to implement. And that's enough to serve 450 families. And so these are the tough decisions, that we're playing with. But again, we don't know the federal funding, so we could get 5 million more. Like, we're going to get 2.5 million extra this year. That can happen again next year as HUD sees our money going up or our spending going up. They issue notices where there's additional money available. We will always apply for it, and so it's just there's a lot of unknown due to timing of these things. Just for the sake of conversation, I did run a scenario where we went up to 110% on all zip codes, so went to the max for all zip codes, which is 110% of the small area fair market rents. It was like $8.2 million to implement and service to 650 families. And so I don't think that's necessary, which is why I didn't put it on here for a scenario, just because I feel like we're within average rents with this 100% scenario. So here's, where I want your input and your comments, but a couple things to remember. We haven't made any substantive changes since 2020 when we first implemented this. Because last year when small area fair market rents came out, we didn't really have much data because it had only been, a few months and we didn't have full data. Increased payment standards provide increased choice. Joel talked about that. You heard from Hillary and Joel about some of those things. And, we're playing again with the budget impact versus the number of families served. The only other piece of information that we hope to get at by increasing payment standards is increased success, meaning whoever gets a voucher can place it. Our success rates are low right now, 60%. So 60% of families that get a voucher use it. The other 40% come back and are recirculated. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you. Thank you both for your work and for presenting this very complicated data in a really understandable way, so appreciate it. Discussion, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to have to leave in a little bit because I've got a board meeting at 6:30 I have to get to, so I just want to apologize for departure if this item isn't settled. Terry, when do we know, excuse me, Mr. Chair, Terry, when do we know when the federal determination of how much money we're going to get is? Do we have to make the decision now and then roll with whatever it is? Or do we have a pivot point if all the money we hope to get comes in? How does that work?
So, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Johnson, unfortunately, the HUD's timing on budget, they haven't passed the budget, which started October 1st. We're in a continuing resolution period. Last year, we didn't get our funding notice until June. And so we guess, we have a good idea of what we're going to get because remember, our next year's spending is based on, next year's budget is based on this year's spending plus a little inflation. So we kind of have a general idea, but we're rolling with the punches and we just kind of, go with what we think is going to come through and oftentimes don't know until well into the year. So we have to make a decision on this before we know.
And Mr. Chair, just
Yeah,
briefly,
please.
hats off to you. This is hard work, and you know the ins and outs. We're very fortunate to have you. I can't even imagine doing this kind of work every day. I kind of float at the policy level. So I appreciate this, and I think that that's that churn of 40% of the people that are in flux. I mean, they don't have stability, even though they won the lottery of getting the voucher, right? They were on the 7,000 person list and waited however many years to get it. Then they get flown into this 60-40 break if you actually then get to place it. So, I hope you have a good discussion. We had this discussion a couple of years ago when we went to the change that we made, but it's not an easy answer. And I would just say that's why getting those developments built that are going to be forever affordable are so important because they're trying to, solve the problem through brick and mortar and stability. And it's not a one or the other, it's a both and scenario. But for me, that's why I keep looking at how can we continue to get the right number of housing choice vouchers and project-based vouchers, get that mixed too, because that's a whole nother discussion. But hats off to you for this hard work, and I will excuse myself, so.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you have any projection on what 95% or 100% would do to the success rates? Is it purely a dollar issue for success, or do they have other issues that are keeping them from getting into a unit?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Wolf, thank you for the question. If I'm understanding, you're wondering if we go to 95%, what will that do to our success rate?
Yes.
I think we don't really know because the market changes every day. The rental market changes every day. If the vacancy rates in Class C apartments start to soften a little bit, our success rates will go up. If more units get built and people move to Class A and Class B, opening up Class C, that opens up units for voucher holders. If people that we're serving have very high barriers to success, maybe have some criminal background or something in their past, they have a harder time placing their voucher. So it depends on so many things that are out of our control. I think part of it is you look at the higher the rent limits, the more success we will have. That's an assumption I can safely make. What we don't want to do is inflate the rental market by having too high of rent limits and then landlords just increase the rent to that limit. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Joel, what I just said, or.
Mr. Chair, Terry, yeah.
I know, right? And I'm not sure that we're going to move the needle that much on that issue, but, we can assume that the higher the rent limits, the more success we'll have.
Mr. Chair, I'm not looking for an exact scientific answer. I was looking more for a gut. How much is cost and how much is other barriers in keeping people from using their vouchers? Because obviously we'd like as many people who get a voucher to be successful.
Yeah.
Rather than go away without a unit. But like you said, if we go too far, then we distort the cost for everybody else because the landlords want to increase prices to whatever is available. So, I mean, I'm kind of looking between the option 2 and option 3, but to me, if option 2 gets us to more success without messing up the rental market, then, you know, maybe that's a better one. But if we need option 3 in order to really have people be successful, then I would be open to option 3. I just don't want to do more than we have to so that we can serve as many families as possible.
And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf, I've been living and breathing and sleeping these numbers for a couple weeks since they came out, and the more I look at it every day, I think something different, but I do feel like 100% is the right way to go at this point. I was at a state housing conference last week, and housing authorities all over the state, not only in the metro, are toying with the same thing because FMRs have not really gone up this much, I don't know if ever, in my time doing this. So, and nationally, housing authorities all over the country are having these same conversations because it's tough. And so I would, you know, if the decision would be to go to 100%, then we will put, and we have put additional rent reasonableness policies and tactics in place, like, and we've already done some of that with Steph and Chong and the managers. Just if landlords are giving $300 rent increases, it's just crazy, $400 rent increases. And so we're asking for comps, we're asking for what have you done to improve the unit, and really trying to keep those rent limits down, and so we can employ some additional things like that to make sure that we're not allowing giant rents in a unit that isn't, it's not reasonable.
Further discussion, Councilmember Cummings.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there other incentives? Are we thinking of other incentives that we can offer to landlords to encourage them to not raise rents quite so much? Where are we on all of that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Councilmember Cummings, we've done more landlord engagement than in the last 2 or 3 years than we ever have. We had during the pandemic, we had incentive funds to entice landlords to accept a voucher holder, so we could give them a one-time payment if they were a new voucher holder. It didn't work so well. We maybe had a small handful of them. I don't know if we had them looking at Stephanie 4 or something. Yeah. And so what landlords want is they want someone to call if there's a problem. And so we do have our outreach team that does a phenomenal job engaging with landlords and working with mitigating tenant-landlord issues. And we're lucky to have those outreach staff because they do a lot for that. But if there's a problem, it's someone they can call. And so we've tried to streamline our inspection processes. We've gone to full biennial inspection. Inspections are the things that landlords don't like. So we try to get inspections scheduled. We've done landlord training and send our inspectors out how to get your unit to pass on the first time, because that's how they get their money. They have to pass the inspection. So with a landlord that has a high fail rate, we'll send an inspector out to meet with them. So we're doing all kinds of things. We're enhancing our landlord engagement approach this year, just to have more and ongoing and more robust landlord engagement. So if you have other ideas, we'll take them.
Yeah, Councilmember Cummings.
And how much of an issue is what we've heard about in the last couple of years with large entities, oftentimes out of the state, coming in and scooping up, and then, you know, the making minimal changes, but it's no longer affordable. So I know Hopkins is a community that was hit really hard with lots of things being snapped up as, because we're relatively affordable, and we're not so much anymore. So how much of an issue is that?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Cummings, it's an issue. We have, you know, we haven't seen, like the concierge in Richfield, we haven't seen it to that magnitude most recently, but we do have a lot, more than ever, out-of-town investors buying units. Stephanie and I met with one a couple of weeks ago. They were, I think they have 125 new voucher holders. They purchased 125 units in the last couple of years in partnership with us. Not really partnership, they're paying for the units, but they're accepting vouchers. But they, what's happening is the tenants are moving in at their max. And then a year later, they're increasing the rent $100, $200, requiring tenants to purchase refrigerators, fix the furnace, doing all these crazy things that they can do because it's in their lease and we can't control their leases. But we met with them to help them understand the rent burden of the tenants that are living in these units, because if they can't afford them, they're gonna move out, and then you're gonna have to turn over the unit, and that's gonna cost more, And so we've been reaching out to landlords where things like that are happening. We look at, we have recently got some reports on rent burden by landlord in our entire service area for every voucher holder. So we could see if there are certain landlords that are, there's a few others that we've been trying to meet with without luck yet, but, I think that's the hard part is every landlord can have their own lease, and we don't have the power to approve or disapprove the lease. So if the tenant signs a lease that says they have to fix the furnace and replace the refrigerator if it breaks, then they have to do those things. So it puts us in the tenants in a tough spot, for sure.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you. My last question, do you have an idea of what the split is on affordable units at 4 units or less, or greater than 4 units of affordable?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Cummings, the last I looked, I think it was 67% of the folks we serve live in apartments, meaning, apartments, which is how many units? More than 4? Yep. Connected?
Yep.
Labeled as apartments, not duplex, not townhome, not single-family home. So the majority of people do live in apartments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion?
Thanks,
Councilmember
Mr.
Musa.
This is very, really important conversation. I appreciate all the work that you put in. My question is there any wish list items that you think we should, we should do if we can, that can help the situation? And the second question I have, is there possible to engage with foundation community and philanthropic community in Minnesota to address some of the gaps that we see here, so that we can help more families? As someone who really, from a community that highly impacted by this issue, I hear the pain and the frustration every day from the community members. So I just want to, see if there's a possibility in any way that we can really, push the envelope to the limit, so we can help more people.
Ms. Smith?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Musa, the unfortunate part of that is the HUD rules do not allow us to spend local money on subsidy. So we couldn't spend our general fund if we wanted to. We couldn't accept philanthropic dollars to pay for the subsidy. And I think the reason HUD has that rule in place is, we put in $2 million and they have to give us back next year. Then we spend another $2 million, they have to give it back to us next year. And they know that that's not sustainable. And so it really limits us as to what our options are. Now, if there was some form of state-funded rent assistance that was modeled after the voucher program but wasn't the voucher program, I think we could consider some of those things. But from the voucher program, our hands are kind of tied with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a quick question, or maybe it's more of a comment, but Terry, did you say that we have a 60% success rate? Was it? Okay, that was really surprising that it's that low. So thank you for that. And so I think, if you're looking for input, these are difficult decisions. We know that. I would say I'm very close to where Councilmember Wolf is. It means a lot for me to hear you say that, just from what you're hearing within the ecosystem, is you're thinking more of 100%, and I think that makes some sense. It's costly, but one of the things that really matters to me is the future rent burden and how much lower that is. And if we're trying to set, if we're the people that we are serving, set them up for success, to me, that's the only of the 3 options that were put forward, and thanks for putting them forward in that way. That's the only one that's anywhere near, or low enough of a future rent burden that it could go up, right? The others, they would be rent burdened over 40% almost from the start. So that matters to me. And also just to emphasize that so much of, such a huge priority of the council of our metro HRA has been choice, right? And so then you're giving someone the most choice. It's fewer people, but they have the most choice. So that's kind of where my thinking is, if that's helpful. Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I mean, it sounds like we're probably going to end up going with 100%, but it would be good to hear back afterwards, did that make a difference in the success rate?
For sure. Agree. Committee members, anything else? Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I echo what you and Councilmember Woods said. What really mattered for me was the 40% rent burden, with the option 3 with 100%. The sticker price was just a little big for me to swallow, but I could live with us going 100%.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Smith, did you get what you needed out of this conversation, or?
I think I did, but
Okay.
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thanks to both of you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Committee members, anything else? Director Barajas, Michelle?
I just want to say I will not be at the meeting November 7th.
first
We'll
one
have
was
someone else
term.
filling in. Be my first meeting I've ever missed in 12, 14 years, however long. I've been.
Serious? Well,
But
awesome.
I'm blowing this pop stand.
Enjoy your PTO.
And you'll be in good hands.
Enjoy your well-deserved time
Thank
off.
you.
And seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned.